2010. Today? We hope so. We got in the box last week.
To stream this. Well, not everyone heard the question.
Oh, I'm sorry. The question was about streaming. One of the things we've been talking about is as we're trying to take humanities forward technologically as well as these conversations, but one of the things that we want to do is we want to set it up so that we can stream these conversations live over the internet. So the Clayites of the United States, that's what I call them, the followers of Clay Jenkinson, both of them, in Virginia and Idaho and California and every place else that he travels to, Chicago, I mean the list goes on, Colorado, there's a big group down there, I know you've got a following down there. So what we're going to try to do is have these conversations streamed live over the internet. And so we've been working on this, not that everybody cares about all the details, but just to let you know where we're at with this. We ordered a box, and last month we got it. Turns out it was a bad box. And I only call it a box because I don't know what it does, but it's something that hooks up between the camera and the internet that allows this live streaming. And so we got one the other day, and I was really excited because they hooked it up in the studio down on the first floor and in my office on the third floor, and they came up on the third floor and turned on the internet, and by golly, Doug McClay, who's our videographer here, was standing there in their studio, and I was watching him over the internet. The problem, however, is there appears to be another interface requirement because that's fine for the internet on campus. But to get it off campus now, there's something else that we have to do. There's always something else. So, but I know they're working hard on it, and hopefully by that time it'll be streamed on the internet. We're hopeful of that. That gives us a little over a month to work that issue. So, but thank you for your question. The snowbirds that are down in the south this coming January, yeah, we can get that streamed. So we're hopeful that that will be coming up very soon. We'll have that capability. So at any rate, again, on January 24th, 2010, we'll be talking about Wounded Knee. And of course, Wounded Knee is a topic that's huge for us in the Dakotas. Happened, of course, in South Dakota, but sitting here in North Dakota, preparatory to that, actually occurred in December of 1890, December 29th. 1891, and so it's appropriate to talk about it. We'll be talking about it in the wintertime in January, but we're going to try to analyze what Wounded Knee what really happened, some of the facts, some of the myths, and then one of the questions that we ask, as you see in the program, does time heal all wounds? And we will talk about that and repercussions of Wounded Knee that reside with us yet today. So that'll be going on January 24th. And just a quick reminder for those of you that love music, right here on this stage, tomorrow night, starting at 7:30, the Bismarck State College concert band, I think they call it Wind Ensemble, John, is it? Will be playing a concert at 7:30 tomorrow night right here. So please, if you have nothing else to do, please come on down and see that. And I know Clay's got some announcements he wants to make.
Well, I want to get moving, but I wanted just to tell everyone where we are with the two new documentary films that David Borlaug and the Dakota Institute and I are working on. You know, we did the Art Link film, now we're doing Bill Guy, and we've reached about the 65% completion of the interviews for that, and we'll be assembling that film in the spring. And as you know, we're making really unbelievable discoveries about dictaphone calls between President Kennedy and Governor Guy, and we have tape of Governor Guy going to Vietnam in 1967 as an election observer, and it's just a very remarkable, it's a very different sort of documentary from the one on Art Link, but in some ways equally compelling and in a few ways more compelling. So we're working on that, and we have a few more interviews to do, and then we'll start to assemble it. And I'm working with Brenna Doherty of the North Dakota Humanities Council and David Borlaug and the Dakota Institute on a big Eric Severide project. And you remember we talked about Severide last year. But we had some great news this week. Dan Rather, late of CBS, has agreed to be interviewed by us. And so we're going to go to New York maybe yet this fall, before Christmas, to interview Dan Rather. And he's going to give us several hours to talk about the golden age of CBS, and he regards himself as a protege of Eric Sevareid and a big fan. And so that's exciting. And also, the other day I was in Brenna Doherty's office and we got a call out of the blue from Suzanne St. Pierre Sevareid, the third and final wife of Eric Sevareid, who's still very much alive. She was quite a bit younger than Sevareid, and she lives in Worcester, Massachusetts, and she had heard about this project somehow and called and asked to learn more. So now she's agreed to be interviewed, to open doors for us with Charles Osgood and other people who knew him, and also to come to our symposium, which is not, it's kind of maybe a shocking announcement to you, Larry, but it's not going to be in April 2010, it's going to be in November 2010, so we have some scheduling things to do, but it's just great news that we're going to be able to do this really, I think, extraordinary documentary on one of North Dakota's greatest ever citizens, Eric Sevareid, and all these doors are opening, and the thing is going to be, in a sense, keynoted by none other than Dan Rather. So I just want people to be aware that these are in the works and that this is the work that I do with people up at Fort Mandan, David Borlaug, and the Dakota Institute. So that's all cool. And if you know people that have materials about Sevareid and Guy and so on, we're still scanning and looking for more documentary things.
I do know one of the things that you recently found, which is interesting, is a news report that Eric Sevareid did on Governor Guy relative to the ABM that they were putting in North Dakota in 1970. And
well, everybody remembers the ABM missile site at Nakoma. It was only operational for maybe one day. It was a $5 billion project, and because of one of the SALT treaties, it was discontinued almost before it got underway. And Bill Guy played a very important role in the protest march that occurred there in May of 1970. In May 1970, just 2 weeks after Kent State, there was a protest against the site at Nakoma, and Governor Guy handled it really very, very maturely and intelligently, and in the wake of the tragedies at Kent State and Jackson State, and made it possible for this protest to come off without incident, without injury, without arrest. And I think it's his shining hour, because this was a really volatile moment in American life, and we have some Sevareid commentary on Guy's handling of that situation, so it works for both films.
Yeah, that'll be great.
Anyway, to Lincoln.
Okay, let's go to Lincoln. As we developed the topics for this year, of course, we had some of them are directly tied to North Dakota, and others are not so directly tied. Mussolini, for example, is probably not really directly tied to North Dakota, but we'll be talking about Mussolini later. But one of the topics that Clay and I talked about is let's talk about Abraham Lincoln and his influence, his footprint, as we're talking about it, and Clay will explain that in North Dakota. So this is going to be almost a Huntley-Brinkley kind of thing today. Clay's going to take off, and then I'm going to talk a little bit, and then Clay will finish us up. So let's go ahead and start.
Well, first of all, I mean, Lincoln and North Dakota have a connection. It's not a long shot.
Right.
North Dakota's development is absolutely influenced and tied to the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and to the Civil War, and I guess most importantly to what the Civil War enabled to happen in the American West. And we'll come back to this later, but what happened essentially was that the West was a contested ground between free soilers and those who wanted to extend slavery. And because the southern states were so, I suppose you'd have to say, paranoid about being overwhelmed by free soil, they held up a whole series of important national pieces of legislation in the 1840s and 1850s because they reckoned that a Homestead Act, for example, could only hurt their interest in slavery, and a transcontinental railroad in the North could only increase the North's industrial and political might and therefore hurt the Confederacy. And so there was a kind of a siege mentality amongst Southern senators in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s to prevent any further dominance by the Northeast and the Northwest over the country, because they realized that the only way slavery was going to be able to survive is one of two things. If the slave states were roughly in a parity with the free states, and you can talk about all those compromises that occurred, and if the West was not foreclosed to slavery. If the West was foreclosed to slavery, then that meant that the Confederacy would get smaller proportionally year by year until it became overwhelmed by the sheer numbers in the Senate. And so the South was obstructionist for about 30 years. And when the Civil War occurred, no one, I mean, this was not one of the causes of the Civil War, but when it occurred, it suddenly liberated all these national infrastructural programs that had been debated for decades but couldn't get past the obstructionists in the Senate. So North Dakota, Dakota Territory was named in 1861 in the last days of the Buchanan administration. And Lincoln comes into office in March of 1861. And so just in that interim, between January 1st and March 4th, 1861, Dakota Territory is formed, is fashioned out of the public domain. And the first territorial governor in Dakota Territory history was nominated by Lincoln. It was a friend of his from Illinois. And then all this legislation, which is sort of key infrastructural development for what became the North Dakota pioneering phenomenon, was made possible by the Civil War. So that's sort of the setup. And here's Lincoln. I just wanted us not to forget that this is about Abraham Lincoln in so many respects. And these photographs are just such beautiful, haunting photographs of Lincoln. Just look, this is late in the war. John Hay, his secretary, said that Lincoln had aged by at least 20 or 30 years during the 4 years of his first administration. I just have a few quotes so we make sure we don't forget that Lincoln is at the center of this. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. This expresses my idea of democracy. Whatever differs from this, to the extent of the difference, is no democracy. Here's another one. You all know this one. This is where he says, if I could save the Union and keep slavery, I would. If I could save the Union and get rid of slavery, I would. If I could keep some states free and some slave but save the Union, I would. It's really about the Union. The young Lincoln. Here's another one. This is his sort of, oh, sorry. This is his, this is almost a quasi-socialist statement. Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor and could never have existed if labor had not first existed. Labor is the superior of capital and deserves a much higher consideration. There was a radical streak in Abraham Lincoln. Just look at that, Larry. Look at the beauty of Lincoln's face. And this one, I think, is so extraordinary. Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally. Just look at that. I happen temporarily to occupy this big White House. I am living witness that any one of your children may look to come here as my father's child has. And then this, common-looking people are the best in the world. That's the reason the Lord makes so many of them. So let's keep it in perspective. In other words, North Dakota Dakota Territory and North Dakota don't even really rise above the radar during the Civil War because, as you might imagine, Abraham Lincoln had other things on his mind. He was president for 4 years, 1 month, and 11 days, and he was not thinking about North Dakota. And second, Lincoln faced a more fundamental national emergency than any other American president. So if we remember that explains some of it, Larry. For example, the Dakota War of 1862, which we'll come back to, is part of Lincoln's administration. But he admitted when we used to call it the Minnesota Massacre and then the Minnesota Uprising, and now we call it the Dakota War of 1862, because we're more neutral about these things than we used to be. And Lincoln, when this happened, Lincoln said, I don't really know much about Indians. I don't know much about Indian policy. I don't know much about the Indian country of the American West. This sort of sprung up on him in the midst of something much more important to him, which was saving the Union. And he handled the Minnesota uprising with great intelligence, I think, but he admitted freely that this was not one of his prime areas. And then, two, that we're talking about Dakota Territory, not North Dakota. North Dakota is 1889. Lincoln is long since dead by then. Lincoln's Dakota was North Dakota and South Dakota as Dakota Territory. So you get, in a sense, if you're talking about Lincoln's footprint, that footprint is in part at Mount Rushmore. because he's one of the 4 presidents chosen by Borglum to carve into the mountain. There's Roosevelt being carved. This is an artist's conception of the future Mount Rushmore. And there it is from above. Look at how you seldom see it from that angle, but this is just very close to North Dakota. So let's talk quickly about what is a footprint. There's a footprint. There's another footprint, and there's your footprint, Larry.
I will say on the, oh, by the way, you have, what's the word I'm trying to search for? Inside of your program, you've got a little survey to fill out.
Evaluation.
Evaluations.
Misuse of slide.
Misuse, yeah. And last time I read the evaluations, and somebody put that my shoes were very distracting. So.
Who would say that?
I have Clay Jenkinson, I think.
Look at that.
Nice socks.
Yeah. So footprint. Footprint is sort of the influence that a historical character has over a landscape or a society. So many ways can go on. So just quickly, Thomas Jefferson's footprint. The rectangular cadastral survey grid system is Thomas Jefferson, and every acre of North Dakota has been deeded out according to that system. And Jefferson sort of gave us the software of North Dakota by saying those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. And so we've been an agrarian state. The University of North Dakota has that chiseled over its gate. That's an important part of North Dakota's system. The Louisiana Purchase gave us North Dakota. Jefferson's idea was blockish states, and North Dakota, on 3 of its sides at least, is blockish. And you could go on and on about the footprint of Thomas Jefferson on North Dakota. And I would say, from a historical perspective, Jefferson's footprint was much greater than Abraham Lincoln's. And if you think about Roosevelt, there's, by the way, the Louisiana Purchase shows that the eastern northeastern 2/5 of North Dakota was not part of the Louisiana Purchase. And there's the survey grid. The township system of square miles is Jefferson's. It's not his invention, but it's his systemization of the development of the lands of the American West. And here's a piece of Theodore Roosevelt's influence. That's Chase Lake before Roosevelt named it a national wildlife refuge, one of the 2 that he named in North Dakota. Roosevelt, who was a great conservationist and a lover of birds particularly, stepped in to protect America's wildlife from unnecessary mayhem. And Chase Lake was one of 2 wildlife refuges he named in North Dakota. The other one is Stump Lake, which has now been sort of absorbed by Devil's Lake. He also created a national park here, Sully's Hill, which is at Devil's Lake. It's since been demoted. Roosevelt signed the U.S. Reclamation Act in 1902, and we have a reclamation project still from that era up along the lower Yellowstone and the northwestern portion of the Missouri and North Dakota. Roosevelt also added 150 million acres to the national forest, and one of those national forests was in North Dakota. It was at the logging camp ranch. It was called the Dakota National Forest. Woodrow Wilson later changed it into something else. But so you can talk about Roosevelt's footprint here, not to mention his life in Medora, his Elkhorn and Maltese Cross ranches. That Theodore Roosevelt National Park is in a sense an after footprint for him in North Dakota. So his footprint in the state has been mighty. Jefferson never came here. Roosevelt did live here for 3 years. The question I asked you the other night when we were starting to prepare for this is, did Abraham Lincoln ever come here?
And no, we didn't.
How did you discover this?
Excuse me very much. Clay is trying to make fun of me again.
I'm not. This is an honest question.
We had an honest question. We're sitting there at the table, and I said, well, I'll cha-cha it now. I want to take a survey. How many people have heard of cha-cha?
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, okay, all right. Cha-cha is an 800 number, and so we're sitting there at the table, and Clay says, well, I wonder how close he got to North Dakota. And so I said, well, I'll cha-cha it. So Clay goes, what the heck's that? It's an 800 number. You call, you leave a voice message, and so I just asked, what is the furthest west that Abraham Lincoln, that we know that Abraham Lincoln came to? And so I left that message, and then you get back a text message answer.
So you get back 3 text messages.
Okay, you get one that says, this is the question we heard, to make sure that they got the right question.
It right, yes.
Then you get back an ad that you just hit delete on, because somebody's got to pay for this service, right? So there's an ad there.
And then?
Then the third is the answer, and it says, it appears that Kansas is as far west as he made it. And so then we had, based on that, we could then Google Lincoln in Kansas and found out, sure enough, he had
He got to Atchison.
Atchison, Kansas. So we know he got there. Didn't get to North Dakota.
Or South Dakota or Nebraska.
Yeah, but he got into Kansas. And we know that because of Cha-Cha. Thank you very much.
But as a historian, and you are a historian, you have to be a little skeptical of an answer that says, apparently, Kansas.
Well, it's a good answer. It's a good starting point.
I mean, it's like the Oracle at Delphi. I mean, apparently Kansas, that's not fact. Then you have to go further.
Well, we had to go further, but we did find it.
But I mean, we could have just actually used Google.
Maybe.
Yeah, now, you just like this, Cha-Cha.
I love Cha-Cha.
Yeah, great. And what's the number? Do you have it?
I do.
So, I mean, you should give it to people.
I can give it out here at the end.
Okay, so now you take over. So that's what a footprint is, and those are 2 much more prominent footprints in North Dakota. So your view is that you can't understand this unless you understand why Lincoln got elected. Isn't that right?
I think it's important, as the historian that I am, I like to put things in context. And so if we were just to, and Cha-Cha, if we were just to begin with the fact that, say, the Homestead Act or the Railroad Act or any of the things, the Morrill Act, all of those things, as Clay's already mentioned, that occurred after the secession of the southern states, if we just began there, then we're missing how we ended up in that position. And so I think it's really important contextually to understand how it is as a nation. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but how it is as a nation, we ended up with the election of 1860 followed by the secession, quick secession of southern states. And it's only because of that secession that we see the passing of all of these acts that resulted in Abraham Lincoln's footprint in North Dakota. So I'm going to go through these very quickly. So to begin with, this is not the same one we had up there. I made changes to one of these.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I just did what you gave me.
Okay. In 1787, I want to talk about 2 compromises in 1787. The first is a 3/5 compromise, and what that is the southern states that had slaves wanted to count all of the slaves for representation in the House of Representatives. The northern states didn't want to count any of them because they're slaves. They were chattel property. So how can you count chattel property towards representation? So they came up with the 3/5 compromise. The other compromise they came up with was the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise is the fact that we have a House of Representatives based on population of a state, and the Senate based on the fact that everybody's got 2. Now that's the reason North Dakota per capita is so powerful today, is because we've got the United States Senate, and they have seniority, and there's 2 of them. So you take all of the folks that are in California, they've got 2 senators.
35 million people.
And you take 640,000 people in North Dakota, we have 2 senators. Now that becomes important in this discussion because, as we will see in the march west of the United States, we end up with more and more territory opening up, excuse me, more and more territory opening up for statehood. And so the argument is, how does the South keep its balance in the Senate? If all of a sudden all the territory opening up is free, then those become states, and when they become states, then eventually the South is going to be overwhelmed, and Clay already used the word paranoid. What we call the slavocracy of the South was paranoid. They were afraid that Northerners that didn't like slavery were going to pass federal legislation that was going to outlaw slavery, and they were going to lose the basis of their economy and their way of life.
And there could have been no Confederacy had there not been the Great Compromise in Philadelphia, because if we had a proportional system, as Madison wanted, and each state got senators proportionate to its population, the North would have overwhelmed the South long since. So the greatest thing that ever happened to the South was the 2 senators per state compromise.
Which is what drives us towards secession. Okay, the next thing to talk about very quickly is the Northwest Ordinance, which bars slavery north of the Ohio River. Now, there should be a map on this one. Okay, so what happens with the Northwest Ordinance? The Northwest Territory we're talking about is that you can see up in the yellow up there, the Northwest Territory. The Ohio River that borders between the gray and the yellow, the Ohio River by federal legislation becomes the mark at which north of that line would be free. You would not introduce slavery north of that line. South of the line there could be slavery. So we have now set up the dichotomy very early in our republic that on the north will be free, the south will be slave. The Ohio River, by the way, what we call Negro spirituals, when you listen to the Negro spirituals that talk about the River Jordan and milk and honey on the other side, what they're talking about is the Ohio River. If they can get across the Ohio River, they're in free land. And so that becomes the demarcation between slavery and free.
Larry, can I just say two things about that?
Certainly.
Number one, Jefferson was one of the sponsors of what became the Northwest Ordinance in a previous version in 1784. And in that bill, he tried to ban slavery altogether from the American West. That is, north and south of the Ohio. Beyond the original 13 colonies, there would be no slavery. And that provision of the 1784 Land Ordinance, which gave us the rectangular survey grid system at the same time, failed of passage in Congress by one vote. If there had been one vote differently, the entire West would have been barred to slavery in 1784, and this story would be a completely different story. Jefferson lost by one vote.
Could be a different story, but as we see with these compromises,
They keep forcing more
keeps
back.
changing.
The other thing is,
Right.
if you've read Huck Finn, you know, Jim is the slave who's trying to escape from Missouri. What's he trying to get at to? He's trying to get to Cairo, Illinois. And what's significant about Cairo? That's the mouth of the Ohio. If he can get to the Ohio, now he can go up the Ohio towards Pittsburgh, and all that land is free land where he can't be re-enslaved.
Okay. So then the United States, when they formed the Constitution, 1808 was the first year it said that you could ban the importation of slaves in the United States, and that happened. Congress passed that in 1807, and on 1 January 1808, you couldn't import slaves anymore into the United States. So that becomes important because now if slavery is going to sustain itself, it has to sustain itself as what they call a domestic institution. It's going to have to grow domestically within itself in the South, in the slaveholding states. Now comes along 1820. This is important because now this is after the Louisiana Purchase, and now the whole Northwest Territory and the Ohio River that I showed you before is going to change dramatically because now we're going to add some territory to this. So what happens is we end up with
this is the Northwest Territory there.
Okay, and then the Louisiana Purchase, and you saw an earlier map of that before. So now what happens is, how are we going to expand west into this territory? So what happens is they strike the compromise of 1820 called the Missouri Compromise, because obviously there's north of a line there, and that's the line right above the Arkansas Territory. Missouri's sitting north of that, but Missouri was being settled by slaveholders, so they wanted to be a slave state. So Missouri is brought in as a slave state, and there's a line drawn here.
And Maine is free.
And Maine is free. So now we're keeping our balance. And the line drawn there, south of that line, slavery can now grow into the Arkansas Territory, and it cannot, by the Missouri Compromise, it cannot grow north of that line. So we're continuing to figure out ways how we're going to push into the West, how we're going to settle the West, and yet we're going to compromise with a free state, a slave state, a free state, because remember, we got to keep the balance in the Senate. Okay, all of this changes dramatically again with the Mexican War of 1848, because, and I'll show you another map here, we end up with substantially more territory again, and now we have to decide what we're going to do with that territory, again, vis-a-vis being slave or being free. And so they strike the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850 says that California gets to come in free, which really upset the slaveholders because that's all they brought in free was one state. But they opened up in the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, they could be slave if, as they were settled, the inhabitants wanted slavery. So now all of a sudden, the Missouri line, 3630, has become irrelevant again because now slavery could go north. Because Utah Territory theoretically could be settled and end up as slave territory. The South, again, is preserving its right to move slaves into the West, and they're doing everything they can to ensure that, and they're very angry because it was a Southern president that agreed to the Compromise of 1850, and all of a sudden they've got California in there. So now they have to find a way to get other slave states, Texas. Okay. So then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Things have not settled down. Now we've got the issue. In fact, I'll go straight to that map. Okay. Now we've got the issue, Kansas and Nebraska, which is the light area right in the center. There's Kansas and then there's Nebraska. Now we've got the issue of what are we going to do with Kansas. So they decide that in this entire territory, the Kansas-Nebraska territory, in that area, what they're going to do is they're going to allow what's called popular sovereignty. In other words, they're going to allow the people that come in and settle to decide if they're going to have slavery. So as a result of that, and everything north of it, all of that green territory now in the West, except California, of course, all this green territory is now open to slavery by popular sovereignty. And what happens in Kansas, we end up with bloody Kansas. And John Brown, and there's massacres on both sides, and so people are trying to have dominance, and ultimately the Lecompton Constitution in Kansas allows it to have slavery, which of course they were called Beecher's Bibles, which is kind of interesting. There were abolitionists in Kansas that were moving into Kansas, and they were bringing along boxes of guns to give to other abolitionists so they could fight the slaveholders that were in Kansas, and it turned into Bleeding Kansas. But what's important for our purposes here is at this point in time, we've now opened all of the West for slavery except for California. But we're moving quickly, and there's a lot of details in here.
You're saying that theoretically, North Dakota could have been a slave state.
Absolutely. As a result of the Kansas.
From a legal constitutional point of view, given that provision.
Right. So by 1854, with now we've got the issue where this has really, and we can't even, I don't think, understand the tension that this has created as we've tried to create this balance between free and slave states in the Senate. Now all of a sudden, all this territory is open up in the West for slavery. Keeping in mind it's the potential of slavery. It doesn't mean there were going to be a lot of slaveholders that were moving into this part of the country, but the potential was there that they could have slavery.
And the South is fighting. The South believes it's fighting for its very existence in this series of compromises.
In all these compromises. And I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but that just sort of sets it up. So now in 1856, you've got the Republican Party being born for the first time, and from the Southern perspective, the Republican Party is an abolitionist party because the Republicans have opposed all of these issues as we go along. Or the Republican Party has coalesced, I'll say, by 1856 around these issues of free land in the West. It was called free land, free labor, free men. That's what they wanted in the West. So the Republican Party has coalesced around that. Then we ended up with the election. The first year, John C. Fremont in 1856 ran unsuccessfully President of the United States on the Republican ticket. In 1860 now, Abraham Lincoln will run. And this is the election of 1860. What you see, Abraham Lincoln did not win one district in the South, not one. The black area that you see, that's the areas that Abraham Lincoln won the election in. So imagine now, if you're sitting down here, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, okay, you're a slaveholder, you're down here, and now an individual that is tied to abolitionists have won the election in 1860. He wins it in November of 1860. At that time, the president took office in March. So in March of 1861, he'd become president of the United States. And not only did he not win in these areas, folks, he's not even on the ballot. You couldn't even vote against Abraham Lincoln because he wasn't even on the ballot. So now, Abraham Lincoln is elected president in 1860. And all of these issues that have been driving and coalescing around the Republican Party then in 1860, which is the Homestead Act, Transcontinental Railroad, all the things that Clay's going to talk about now, all of those things are on the platform of the Republican Party of 1860. So when they win in 1860, the South begins seceding before Lincoln even becomes president of the United States. Southern states are seceding from the Union. And
So
on that note, you want to...
But don't change it, because if you just look at the black here, it's not solid black, but it's pretty solid black. This is Abraham Lincoln's power base. This is what elected Lincoln president of the United States. He won for the whole country, but immediately the South seceded, and a bunch of border states were very eager to secede and were very edgy about whether they would stay in the Union or not. And so Lincoln's power base is here: industrial, urban, northern, anti-slavery, progressive, and eager for economic development, and opposed to the plantation, cavalier, southern aristocracy, agrarianism. Lincoln's greatness is that instead of just saying, all right, this is America now, and the Confederacy can
let them go,
can go ahead and cling to itself, Lincoln says, no, I'm going to hold this thing together. I can't be the president of the United States and behave in a constitutionally responsible way unless I hold this thing together. But because he spends 4 years trying to bring this part of the country back, the Confederacy is effectively disenfranchised for that whole period. And when it's disenfranchised, this becomes the governing body of the development of the American West. It's this progressive industrial part of America that then develops the Northwest. And that North Dakota is still largely empty of white people. It has a full population of native peoples. It has white traders and some white trappers. But North Dakota is effectively empty of white people at this time. And Lincoln's America then develops the upper Great Plains and the American Northwest through a series of key legislative passages, which would have been impossible if the Confederacy had stayed in. That's the point.
That's the point.
And the Confederacy, even if it had stayed in and the issue of slavery had been disarmed somehow, the South is still going to be against many of these developments, because if there's going to be a transcontinental railroad, why should it go through the North? Why shouldn't it go through the South? And if there's going to be a Homesteading Act, why shouldn't it accommodate Southern agrarianism rather than small farmer homesteadism? So North Dakota's history is impossible to think about without the little lecture you've just provided.
And as long as if you'll show them where the Gadsden Purchase is at, down here. Jeff Davis was Secretary of War for the United States before he becomes President of the Confederacy. And what he did is he actually platted out the first transcontinental railroad to go from the South across Texas, across the Gadsden Purchase
from New Orleans to what would become L.A.
Yeah, and so that was the plan. And so the North, of course, wanted a railroad that's going from Chicago and heading west. And that's what the North wanted, because obviously they want to get to the markets. And keep in mind, the whole purpose for a transcontinental railroad, right, is to find passage to the east. That really what it boils down to. That's what the Europeans had been looking for when they discovered the two great continents. They were looking for a passage to the east. And the transcontinental railroad, for the first time, will give those on the eastern seaboard transit to the east. And
you mean to Asia?
To Asia, yeah, to Asia, to the East Asia. So at any rate, okay, now that lays the groundwork. We went through that very quickly, and I'm sure Perry's here. He could probably argue with us all day on the points we raised, but there's so many points to bring up. So what we do want to do, though, is move on to these very specific issues.
Okay, but go back to that map now as we talk about transcontinental railroads, because it's really important to put this in a historical context, Larry, because a transcontinental railroad was an incredible undertaking. It was like going to the moon in the 1960s, or building Hoover Dam, or TVA. I mean, this was not a simple road being built. This was using just emerging engineering techniques and railroad building techniques, and the idea of placing a railroad across the continent when this was largely uninhabited by white people was it was a technological challenge, it was an economic challenge, it was a political challenge. It wasn't even clear that you could do it. And so there were surveys sent out to see whether it was even physically possible. And the reason why the South was so edgy about this is we know that within 25 years, a whole number of transcontinental railroads got built. There was a Southern Pacific, there was a Central Pacific, and there was a Northern Pacific. So there were at least 5, but the main 3 I've just mentioned. But nobody knew that at the time. The thought was there's going to be one and only one, and whoever gets it is going to control the future of this continent. It's like the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was the most successful of the canals of the first half of the 19th century. There were many others that were going to be the gateways to the West, but because New York did it, New York then became an economic juggernaut, and the South was well aware that whoever got the Transcontinental Railroad would control the future of the country. They were wrong. There was going to be room for plenty of transcontinental railroads. And the South knew that if the Transcontinental Railroad went from the north to the west coast, that would effectively further eclipse the Southern agrarian way of life. And they would become dependent for transport on Northern interests. So this was a really big, big debate. And because the South leaves, we get two transcontinental railroads that are effectively in the north. We get the UP-CP going from Sacramento to Council Bluffs, and we get the Northern Pacific going from Lake Superior through North Dakota to Tacoma. And those are built. Our first transcontinental railroad in North Dakota, we got two, the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. Ours was authorized in 1864 and completed on September 6, 1883. So just under 20 years it took to go about 2,000 miles from Lake Superior to Tacoma. And the Central Pacific was completed, as everybody knows, in 1869 with the golden, if you go advance the slide, the Golden Spike Ceremony, I think is the first slide here. That's Promontory Point. That's 1869. Go ahead and go forward. So Lincoln was a railroad attorney. He understood railroads very well. Go ahead. We can just pass beyond this. But here's now we're getting to the point of what this means for North Dakota. And if you might want to have your handout handy. I've done a very crude drawing on it of the way the land grants worked. But look at this, first of all, Larry. These are land grants from the federal domain to a range of commercial railroad corporations in the second half of the 19th century, to railroads as an incentive to enable them to create the railroad system that we have. This swath in North Dakota is the NP land grant. You see Minnesota gave 40% of Minnesota, I mean literally 40% of Minnesota was granted to various railroads during the 19th century to enable Minnesota to become the economic juggernaut that it is. You see the UP Central Pacific also had enormous land grants. The Southern Pacific had giant land grants. They're everywhere. If you see North Dakota, though, notice this fundamental distinction. The NP, which got to Fargo in 1871, got to Bismarck in 1873, and then got stalled by an economic panic, and got to the Montana border in 1881. The NP got 40 sections of land per mile of railroad built as an incentive in North Dakota. So if you look at this little handout, it's very crude, I know, but you know how sections work. A section is 6 square miles. So there are 36 sections in a township. And so each one of these represents a township. You have 8 townships here, and in the middle is the railroad. So you have 8 townships, altogether 4 on each side of the railroad. As an incentive to the Northern Pacific to build through North Dakota, the government of the United States granted the NP 40 sections per mile, which is over half of the sections for every mile built. So if you look at it, it's a checkerboard. There are 18 above, 18 below the railroad. It's 6 miles north of the railroad, 6 miles south of the railroad, but that doesn't cover it. In order to get to 40 sections per square mile, you have to add 4 more. They're the 3 and 1 on the bottom 2 tiers that I've got here. So all the way across North Dakota, from Fargo to Beach, there's a swath of a 16-mile corridor, a little more than a 16-mile corridor, in which every other section was deeded permanently to the Northern Pacific, both the surface area and the mineral rights. Now, the NP owns almost no surface land in North Dakota and its successors now, but it still owns an enormous amount of mineral right in North Dakota. So this land grant is just gigantically important in the history of the state. But notice that James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad which was completed a decade later, existed without significant land grants of any sort. He built it with private funds and with no significant land grants. So the question, another question we had the other day was, what percentage of North Dakota was railroad land grant land? And the answer is 24%. 1 in 4 acres of North Dakota was given to railroads as an incentive to complete these transcontinental routes.
We actually had a bet on this, by the way. We'll talk about this later. I lost. The question was how much of North Dakota was homesteaded.
Well, we'll come back to that, but let me just show you a couple more really interesting graphics here, Larry. Here's one from Nebraska. Look at what the UP got. That's the swath of land that the Union Pacific got to build, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific. Here's
now, when you're showing that swath, back up to that.
Sorry.
Understanding it's checkerboard.
It's checkerboarded.
It's checkerboarded, just like this drawing that he's got on this. So it's not that they've got
it's not a solid
It's
phalanx.
not a solid. It's checkerboarded.
But the richest corridor of Nebraska, the Platte River Valley, was given over, and I'm not saying this is necessarily wrong, it just is a fact of history. The richest corridor of Nebraska was given over to the railroad as an incentive. And the railroad, I mean, this was smart national planning because the railroad had that land, then it would sell that land to your homesteader grandparents. Then they would live close to the railroad where they would have their farm, and then they would ship their wheat and cattle on that railroad to market. So it's a highly intelligent land development system for the United States as well as for the NP. Here's another one of the Central Pacific Union Pacific. This is California. Look at this. Those are land grants in California. You know, I don't know what percentage, but that's more than a quarter, Larry. Here's another one of, this one's not, it's kind of pixelating, but it's North Dakota. And here's the NP. The NP is only transcontinental in a half-hearted sense. It starts at Duluth, it comes through North Dakota, and then it goes out to Tacoma. This is propaganda literature by the NP to settle the lands that it had been granted. Here's a cartoon showing somebody's disaffection with the railroad land grants and how much of the West they were gobbling up. This is more, again, about our Red River Valley, more farmland stuff. So you get the point, Larry, that, and people always say, oh, the railroads, you know, were given too much and so on, but it's not really true from a historical point of view. This was sort of what it took to get this thing done, and the railroads didn't keep those lands for the most part, and those lands have gone on to, the railroads created Jamestown, Valley City, Bismarck, Dickinson, Richardson, Taylor, Freiburg, Beach. The development of North Dakota along the I-94, what we call the I-94 corridor, is absolutely dependent upon those railroad land grants in the 1860s and 70s.
Yeah. Before we move off the railroad, let's talk just a little, you and I were chatting about, think about the railroad stopping here in 1873. The Battle of Little Bighorn occurs in 1876. Imagine what a different, you know, I know this is an ahistorical thought, but imagine if the railroad had continued on into Montana in 1876 and General Terry and Lieutenant Colonel Custer and the rest of the 7th had ridden trains out to the west as opposed to having to go by wagon and horseback. It's just an interesting thought that it stopped here in 1873, and because of the panic of 1873, it
well, Jay Gould went bankrupt trying to fund this railroad and in 73, and he helped to touch off the panic of 73, and then the railroad got stuck here on the Bismarck side for 8 years, and there was some use of an ice bridge. They used to lay tracks across the ice in the Missouri to cross to the other side, but there was no bridge until till the end of that era. And the bridge that you still see here, the NP bridge, was $1 million bridge. So imagine how expensive that was in 1873. And that enabled them to get to the other side. As soon as they got to the other side, they finished the NP rather quickly. It got to the Montana line in 1881, and in September of 1883 it was finished, and they had a golden spike ceremony in Montana. So, but just imagine for a moment if if Lincoln, if the Confederacy hadn't seceded, or if the bill hadn't passed in 1864 to produce a transcontinental railroad through what's now North Dakota, imagine how differently the history of North Dakota would be if there had not been a single fundamental infrastructural line across the state until when? In the 20th century sometime.
Yeah. It would have been built eventually.
Well, not
I think we're
necessarily
agreeing on
through
that.
North Dakota. It could have been
Not
through
North
South Dakota.
I agree, yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. I mean, we are directly the beneficiaries of
The
that
secession.
the 1864 Railroad Act. And you
Right.
can say what you want about the land grants, but North Dakota would have been impossible to settle without that event.
So we could say that we are direct beneficiaries of the secession of the southern states.
Yes, we could. Here's a homestead for you. That one's in the Badlands. This one I love. When you think about homesteading, you always think about Willa Cather or something, and then you realize that it was really rough. Imagine living there. I can't imagine you living there, Larry, actually.
I want to tell a story about
Okay.
that before we go. One of the things that we passed out to you, and I've got it on a tripod up here if you want to come up and look at it, is my grandfather's homestead papers, which I'm quite proud of. I mean, I'm a product, a legitimate product of the Homestead Act of North Dakota. I am. And I've got to tell you a quick story. My grandmother, who actually, they got married, they were living in Minnesota and, had the typical board house and, picket fence and all that sort of stuff. And my grandfather and his brothers all decided they were going to go out, and we'll show you a satellite photo of where they go, out in Adams County, and they were going to go out there and they were going to homestead, and Annie was her name. And so Joe told Annie that he'd come back, and they already had a couple of kids, and he would come back and get her later, and the typical story. And so they went out there and they homesteaded, and they built sod houses. And so when he went back to get my grandmother, he took her from this white house in Minnesota with a picket fence around it to this. And
Well,
my
this is not
grandmother
your actual-
talks about, pardon?
This is not your actual farm.
No, this is not actual. Yeah, but it reminds me of it. And so, but I remember my grandmother, who always had a Norwegian accent, maybe we all do, I guess, in North Dakota, but having her tell the story about, she rode the train then, and I'm thinking it was rain. She got off the train, and my grandfather met her there in a buckboard, and they got on the buckboard and they rode down to Adams County, and they came over the top of the hill, and there was her new home, which was a sod house. And my grandmother said, I cried for weeks. It had to be just terribly depressing to move from an environment that she was living in Minnesota to move out into the West to a homestead that they had a sod house. Later on, he built her the biggest house in the area and had electricity. And what I really like is their electricity was wind generated, which is what we're all going to now. So at any rate, let's move on.
So let's look at the statistics. Homestead Act 1862, during the Lincoln administration, there had been proposals for Homestead Acts back to 1841, but they had constantly been stymied by Southern senators who were afraid that a homestead movement would be a real or an implied threat to the continuation of slavery. So in 1862, with the Confederacy out of the way, Homestead Act is passed. Every North Dakotan reads about this all of his or her life. But here are the statistics. 1.6 million homesteads nationwide, 270 million acres, that's half of the Louisiana Purchase, or 10% of the United States, was successfully homesteaded during the period between 1862 and 1915. Here's North Dakota. 118,472 total homesteads in North Dakota proved up. That's 17,417,466 acres out of a total of 44 million acres. That's 39%, Larry, of North Dakota that was homesteaded. So 39% of North Dakota homesteaded, 24% of North Dakota railroad land grant. Isn't that amazing? And then you have Indian reservations, that's some percentage of North Dakota. You have military reservations like Fort Lincoln and Fort Abercrombie. If you start doing the math, there isn't that much left. There isn't that much land that isn't part of one of these dispensations. This is from National Homestead of Homestead National Monument in Beatrice, Nebraska, has a map for each state showing the proportion of the state that was homesteaded. So that white, this is a very vague map, but that white portion in the center there represents the 39% of North Dakota that was homesteaded. Of course, it wasn't all in that block, but that's just their graphic way of showing the different percentages in the different states. And if you're interested in this, Homestead National Monuments website is a marvelous resource. Now let's look at, Larry and I got interested in the first homestead in Dakota Territory. Once the Homestead Act was passed, it wasn't quite like the land grab in the Oklahoma Panhandle, but there was a rush. And so we wanted to know who was the first person to homestead property in what is now the Dakotas, South and North Dakota. We'll come back to this, Larry, but according to Lounsbury, who wrote an early history of North Dakota, it was a man named Malin Gore, and his homestead was here, right here. This is the miracle of Google Earth. So we went to Google Earth, and this took Larry and me about 7 hours. I found the range and township information in Lounsbury, and then we tried to find a website where we could key that in, and it would then go to Google Earth and show us that property. And
it worked.
Once you figure out how to do it, it's easy, but we finally did. And so here's the 160 acres, the homestead of Malin Gore in Union County, South Dakota, just hours after the Homestead Act was permitted. Let's back up. Here's Union County. It's down by Vermilion. This is the Missouri. Here's that little nipple at the bottom of South Dakota. Here's Union County. Here's where his homestead is. Back up once more. And here's South Dakota. This is Nebraska. North Dakota up here. Minnesota here. Iowa here. So here's the first homestead. And the pattern basically it moved from here out to here and then up towards North Dakota. North Dakota was a latecomer to all of this. The first homestead in what's now North Dakota was by Pierre Rolette up near Pembina, but it came substantially later, Larry. So what an interesting tool. You could take your farm or your house or the place you grew up and type in the range and township coordinates and have it spotted on Google Earth or any of the other satellite mapping systems. Isn't that cool? And so then, now we're way back. So there it is. Now, what did you learn, though, Larry? Well, there's some doubt about whether Malin Gore actually did this.
Well, he was the very first to walk in and file for a Homestead Act. Eventually, there was Fisher, I think it was. There was a man named Fisher that moved on to it, asked if he could live there, and Gore said yes, so Mr. Fisher moved on to it. And when it was finally actually filed, proved up, it was actually Fisher's wife. So she becomes the owner, ultimately, of the very first homestead that was filed.
It wasn't the first proved, but it was the first proved from the first file.
From the first filing.
If that makes any sense. So, North Dakota 39%, South Dakota I think 37%, about half of each state were homesteaded during that period between 1862 and 1915. Another result of the free soil movement in the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. I don't think your family's one is on here, Larry.
Oh, you didn't put it on?
But you're right here, right? Right
yeah,
down there, and you're heading here. All right, so then let's go quickly to the Morrill Land Grant. This had also been debated for decades. At the time, what comes to you, Larry, at this time is that there was so much public domain. There was some conception that there was an infinite amount of public domain and that you could give lavish portions of it away to this and that because A, it was marginal country that hadn't yet been proved up, and B, there was so much of it. So you get that enormous privatization that comes for 10% of the country through the Homestead Act. You get the railroad land grants where I think altogether the railroad land grants gave out 500 million, no, that's not true, 100 million acres of the American West. So about a fifth of the Louisiana Purchase was given to railroads as an incentive. And then a much smaller one, but an extremely important one, was the Morrill Land Grant Act of June 2nd, 1862. This was pioneered by an Illinois congressman, but later taken up by a man named Morrill of Vermont. And the idea was to give lands from the public domain to the states to create technical agricultural colleges. And here he is, Justin Morrell, 1810 to 1898, a Vermont congressman. Under the terms of this, each state received 30,000 acres from the public domain per member of its congressional delegation. So this actually discriminated against low population states. But North Dakota got 90,000 acres of its land, of its federal land, deeded to the state to create an agricultural institution. Here's the Morrill Act itself. Here's the dedication laying the cornerstone at Morrill Hall at what's now NDSU in May 1921. Here's Morrill Hall today. There's a shrine actually to the Morrill Land Grant Act, but each state got this acreage. And Larry, there are 100 land grant colleges in the United States. And we have one, NDSU, and it's not, of course, just NDSU. The second Morrill Act in 1890 created the Extension Service and the agricultural experiment stations. And so I think North Dakota has 8 NDSU-controlled experiment stations in places like Dickinson and Fargo and so on, in Cooperstown, not Cooperstown, Carrington. And we have the extension agents, the county agents in every county. All that comes from this Jeffersonian legislation that if we're going to have a farmer's economy, that we should train farmers in agriculture and in the classics so that we would have this highly cultured farm population. And what's so interesting is how earnest North Dakota was about this. You know, statehood for North Dakota is November 2nd, 1889. In the first legislative session in North Dakota, almost the first act that was presented was one to create NDSU. And NDSU was created in March of 1890. North Dakota's not even a year old yet. It was then called North Dakota Agricultural College, and it took advantage of these provisions of the Morrill Acts to create an agricultural college, then university now, in North Dakota. So this has been one of the most successful of all federal educational projects, and it comes straight out of this same era of the Lincoln administration. Here's another land grant image. Then the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The U.S. Department of Agriculture is born during the Lincoln administration. This was quite a congressional session in 1862. Think of what they accomplished. And they produced the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It didn't get cabinet status until Grover Cleveland in 1889, but it was a sub-cabinet position during the last third of the 19th century. And I mean, imagine North Dakota without the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The farm program alone is one of the most significant forms of economic activity in North Dakota in our time. And of course, we've produced a Secretary of American Agriculture, Ed Schaefer, taking the oath of office. There's a cartoon of him driving a tractor. Here he is. I love this photograph because he looks so perplexed. So I hope you don't mind, Shyla, but I added this little bubble. But look at it. I mean, so we're so lucky we've produced a Secretary of American Agriculture, and that the Department of Agriculture born at the same time. So then finally.
Yeah, before we move on to this, can we talk a little bit about these? Okay, we've talked about the Homestead Act, the Morrill Land Grant Act, and the Railroad Act. And the reality is, of course, North Dakota is just tremendously indebted to all three of those. And what it really signifies to me is the dominance of the yeoman farmer.
The Jeffersonian ideal of the agrarian.
Of the agrarian, and how the West was going to be settled by free men, free land, and all that. Whereas without the secession, and I know I'm sort of repeating what we talked about, but you can't overemphasize, I don't think, without the secession of the southern states in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the three acts that we've talked about today that were all passed
in 1862 or 4.
62 or 64, you know, within 1 year, well, 1 year of Lincoln taking office or 3 years of Lincoln taking office. All of these acts that affect us tremendously occurred because the southern states seceded over the issue of slavery.
Now, it's important to remember that most of this probably would have happened at some point anyway.
Eventually.
I mean, we got to be aware of making Abraham Lincoln the kingpin here because he wasn't much concerned about the West. He had other things going on. The president at that time was not as powerful a figure as the president is today, and so Congress took the lead. These were really northern senators and congressmen who did this, and Lincoln was for it, whereas Buchanan had vetoed a Homestead Act and had vetoed railroad bills. So Lincoln didn't stand in the way. But these were not Lincoln initiatives in the same sense that FDR had his initiatives during the New Deal. Lincoln was there and he was favorable to these things, but he wasn't the originator of this set of...
Well, these took decades.
Right. They just became possible because of the unique political circumstances of his time.
Right.
And Lincoln was a railroad guy and understood the importance of railroads, and he certainly was a free soiler, but he is not the central figure in making those things happen, is my only point.
But my point is that we end up with the dominance in the settlement of the West squarely based on free farmers as opposed to the slaveocracy that would rather have, or certainly, it probably have been impossible for slavery to grow into the West just because of the economics of it. But clearly, with them, they had the power to stand in the way, and until their secession, they did stand in the way.
I think the way I would put it is that if the South had stayed in the Union at the time, it would have delayed the development of North Dakota by a decade or maybe 25 years.
Right.
That we got hothoused because of the Civil War.
Good way to put it.
But this was going to happen in some form anyway. But our development, and L. N. Robinson, the great North Dakota historian, believes that we did too much too soon, that we overdeveloped the state before it was really ready to be developed, and that we're living with the consequences of that up until the present day. And you could argue that we were developed a little sooner than really was right, but it is what it is. In all this discussion we've had so far, Larry, we haven't really talked about Native Americans, but of course, this is a key part of this story because all of this development was occurring on lands owned by, claimed by, and traditionally the homes of Native peoples. And we've talked before about Indian policy in the 19th century, but there's a victim to all of this development, and the victim in this case tends to be the Indian cultures of North Dakota. And Lincoln happened to be president when one of the great flare-ups occurred at the interface of the white advance into the American Northwest and Native American resistance of that advance, and that was the Dakota War of 1862, or the so-called Minnesota Massacre.
Right.
So let's just quickly look at it. The actual event occurred, the crisis in Minnesota occurred between August 17th, 1862 and December 26th, 1862. And Larry, can you just talk a little bit about what happened?
Well, do you have the maps?
Yeah. There's one.
Okay. If you got your little pointer. Okay, the area we're going to be talking about really is down in this area. What this map shows, by the way, and for those of you that have been in these before, we've used these maps before, the Bureau of Ethnology in the 1890s developed a study of all of the land that was acquired from the Native Americans and through what legal mechanism that was done. And it was first done through treaties. Later on, there was legislation, and then finally there were executive orders that the land was acquired by the federal government. All this land that we've been talking about, that was free land given away to free farmers, was all at one point given by Native Americans to the federal government through a mechanism such as the treaty or whatever.
Land cessions of different sorts.
So what this map shows is the different chunks of Minnesota and how they were given to the federal government. And we don't have the list. There are different treaties and different executive orders and such. But the area that we're going to focus in is really down in this area, and I think the second map shows
This is the Minnesota St. Peters River. And according to the Treaty of 1851, this is where the Sisseton and the Dakota were confined. In other words, there was going to be some Indian land in northern Minnesota, But in the first developed, this is the first developed part of Minnesota, this yellow band here along the Mississippi and up towards Ortonville. And this country was going to be taken by white pioneers during this very period, a little earlier actually. And a treaty in 1851 confined the southern Minnesota Indians, the Sisseton and the Dakota, to this little strip along the Minnesota River. And here's a better map of it.
There we go. So this is the area we're talking about. Basically, I will say, and I'm sure we can both add to this, but what happens by the time we get to 1862, there's two really important events that have occurred. And then we'll talk about events particular to what happens in what ends up in the Minnesota Uprising or the Dakota War of 1862. The first major event is white men started killing each other. The Civil War really emboldens, in many regards, Indians in the West, because now all of a sudden the white men are off in the East killing each other, and literally in some Indian nations, the idea is that as long as they're preoccupied out here, we can do something. They're preoccupied way over someplace else, not really a concept of where it is, but they're fighting someplace else. And the second thing that occurred, and particularly what's important to Minnesota, is that when they called up the draft, they started going out to the reservations and what were called half-breeds at the time. They were actually drafting them and getting them to volunteer to come into the military. So the young warriors of the Dakota tribes are sitting around saying, this is pretty interesting. We may have an opportunity here to actually drive the white men from Minnesota. We might have that opportunity. And so while that's going on, and this whole thing starts with 4 guys who actually take that opportunity, but while all that's going on, the other piece that's going on is annuity payments have been delayed now in 1862. The Dakotas are entitled to annuities. The annuities are guaranteed to them in treaties. The annuities are to pay for their land, and so the annuities are being delayed. And the stores for them, the food for them, has been locked up by the agencies. And the agents aren't going to unlock it. In fact, one agent makes a comment because one of the Indian leaders comes to him and says, you need to unlock the stores, you need to feed our people are hungry. And he says, if you're hungry, you can eat grass. And which is not a very good way to approach people that are being desperate. And eventually, by the way, he gets murdered and his mouth is stuffed with grass. So they said he can eat grass.
A little karma.
So.
But I mean, if you think about it, Larry, this land, I mean, at one time, native peoples owned the continent, of course, and so white people come in a series of treaties and land grabs and land cessions and so on, and they confine this group of Native Americans to this strip. The rest is going to be white deeded land under these homestead provisions. And so the Indians are confined to this strip, and because of this set of land cessions, they're guaranteed certain annuities and rations and equipment and economic advisors and health care and so on under the utmost good faith clause of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And so this is now their homeland, what's left of all of their homelands, and they've been guaranteed that the payoff for this set of radical land cessions will be a reliable food supply and cash payments and technical help. And then that gets held up in August of 1862, partly because of the chaos of the war, but largely because of the relative indifference of the agents and speculators. And so finally, they're literally driven into rebellion, and when they do, they kill 350 or so white people in the region of southern Minnesota over the course of about a month. And that's known historically as now the Dakota War. And
it really many of them are German immigrant farmers, and what really catches them off guard is many of the Indians living in these tracts of land had adopted what was then called white man clothes. Many had become Christians. They were going to church. They were going to schools. They were living in houses, many of them, and so if you can kind of imagine if you were a German farmer, immigrant farmer living next to the reservation, and many of them had friends that Dakota people that were friends, and in fact, during what's called the uprising, some of the whites are saved by their Dakota friends who will secret them away when all of this explodes on the frontier.
And we need to hasten forward
Yep.
here. I want to get some questions, but I mean, the thing to think about is what would it take for you who are in this room to rise up and overthrow the society that you happen to be absorbed by? I mean, what would it take for us to go armed into the streets because we're so hungry or so angry or so frustrated or so feeling that our lives have been marginalized in such a way? I mean, these were we would have regarded as white men's Indians. That's the case you're making, that these are accommodationist native peoples living in Minnesota, driven into rebellion. And then when that happened, all sorts of atrocities occurred on both sides.
Yeah.
But what happened was, here are the Sissetons at this time. Little Crow, one of the leaders, a reluctant leader of that. What happened was that a group of 4 young men went to a ranch, killed the people, did horrible things, and that was just like a border depredation. And when that happened, the Sisseton and the Dakota said, it's now or never. We better just do it. Now that white people are going to come and crush us anyway over this, we better just have our moment here, and that led to the war.
If I can add,
Yeah.
again, the young warriors are thinking this is an opportunity at this time. Now, Little Crow tells them, and Clay already said he was a reluctant leader. Little Crow tells them, you can kill 1 white man, 10 more are going to show up. We're not in a good position. But Little Crow also wanted to be the leader, wanted to be a leader, and so he ended up reluctantly leading this rebellion or uprising or whatever you want to call it, this war. He ended up as a leader, knowing good and well when they went into it that they were going to end up being defeated because he knew the numbers that they were contending with.
So how does this get to North Dakota? Let's just quickly
Yep.
get there.
Yep.
So the rebellion is mopped up in Minnesota, and Little Crow is right. I mean, there's no way that this is going to succeed in any larger sense. And so the white settlers and the white militia and the U.S. Army, such as it is in Minnesota, are able to mop up the war by the end of September. Then there are, and these are just highly inflammatory illustrations from the times of Indian depredations against white people during this time. In the end, peace is restored in Minnesota. 330 are tried, 303 are convicted.
Right.
So 303 Native Americans are convicted of murder and mayhem and are sentenced to hanging. So Minnesota's response to this, white Minnesota's response to this, is going to be to hang more than 300 Native Americans, about 1 for 1. There were 350 white people killed during the uprising, and now it's going to be 303 that are going to be hanged. Here's where Abraham Lincoln comes in. When Lincoln heard this, he said, no, we're not doing that. That's an unbelievable overreaction that's counterproductive and lacks basic humanity. We're not going to hang 303 people. But the Minnesota authorities, led by Governor Ramsey of Minnesota, refused to cooperate with Lincoln. They said, stay out of it. Lincoln said, no, I'm the commander-in-chief. I insist that you send me the dossiers on all 303, and I will go through them myself. And the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, fighting for the nation's survival in the Civil War, spent weeks going through every dossier of the 303 who were sentenced to death. And he eventually reduced that number from 303 to 39. Still the largest mass execution in American history on December 26, 1862 in Mankato, Minnesota. If you've been to Mankato, there's a monument there. Here's another version of it. 33 Native Americans were simultaneously hanged in Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862 as the final act of that portion of the Dakota Uprising of 1862. No execution in American history has come close to it, but imagine if Lincoln had not stepped in, Larry. I mean, it's bad enough as it is, but imagine if Lincoln hadn't stepped in and looked at those dossiers. And here's what's so interesting about it. When Lincoln did that, Governor Ramsey said, you'll be lucky if you get reelected in 1864 with Minnesota's votes. And Governor Ramsey said to Lincoln, you need to execute more people to maintain your political control of Minnesota in the 1864 election. And Lincoln famously wrote back and said, I'm not going to be elected by way of hangings. But when the election results came in, Lincoln barely defeated McClellan in Minnesota in 1864, and only because Minnesota was pro-Union. If they could have been pro-Union and jettisoned Lincoln, they would have done it, because they were so angry that he didn't execute more people. So that's how stirred up things were on the frontier. How does that relate to North Dakota? Well, there's a monument at New Ulm, but two things. It wasn't enough to close the door in 1862 on December 26th. The United States Army decided it needed to chastise the Indians who had escaped after the uprising, and so they sent out punitive expeditions in 1863 and 1864, and those expeditions occurred in North Dakota. That's the key to this, and here they are. This is the Battle of Whitestone Hill. There are several battles in Kidder County, Big Mound and Dead Buffalo Lake, and Stony Lake is in Burleigh County, and then here's the Battle of Killdeer Mountain. I've got them listed better here. In 1863, there were three battles that were led by General Henry Hastings Sibley of Minnesota. These are all in North Dakota. The Battle of Big Mound, July 24th and 25th. Not too much death there. Battle of Dead Buffalo Lake in Kidder County. There's signage at each of these, by the way, if you wander out there. The Battle of Stony Lake. Those occurred all in a week's period, led by General Sibley in 1863. Some loss of life on both sides, particularly for Indians, but not any pitched battles. Also in 1863, Alfred Sully fought a battle at Whitestone Hill. That was September 3rd through 5th, 1863. That was a significant battle, and there's a magnificent monument there in Dickey County. And then the most famous of the battles, Larry, was the Battle of Killdeer Mountain on July 28th and 29th, 1864. I'll come back to the significance of that in a minute, and then it ended with the Indians escaped from Killdeer Mountain, and there was a subsequent skirmish at Square Butte near Medora, the Battle of the Badlands, August 10th and 11th, 1864. Remember Sully, who was related to the painter Sully. Sully is the one who said that the Badlands were, quote, hell with the fires put out. And he helped to create the modern mythology of the Dakota Badlands. Here's Killdeer Mountain, where the battle occurred in July of 1864 on a day that was 107 degrees heat. 2,000 white soldiers against several thousand Native Americans. Complete victory for the U.S. Army, thanks to artillery fire. Here's the Medicine Hole. You've probably heard of it or been to it up at North Killdeer Mountain. That's part of where the battle occurred. This is the view of Sully's troops would have been right down here on that July day in 1864, and they were bombarding the Indian encampments with artillery. There's a monument. There's a State Historical Society monument there. That's the monument at dusk. There are also at the DeVernac Ranch there are graves and there's historical signage placed there by the State Historical Society. The DeVernac family has done extensive archaeological work on the Killdeer Mountains related to that famous battle. Just one last piece of it. A woman named Frances Kelly, you know this story, Larry, was traveling with her husband and a stepchild from Kansas City to the goldfields of Montana, and the men were killed and she was captured on July 12th, 1864, and she went with a group of Lakota on a loopy journey from today's Douglas, Wyoming to Killdeer, North Dakota, and she was a witness to the Battle of Killdeer Mountain, and there's back from where the raid occurred near Douglas, Wyoming. She wrote this book, My Captivity Among the Sioux Indians. If you haven't read it, it's one of the most interesting captivity stories in the history of the Great Plains. She was taken from Douglas, Wyoming, up along the Powder River, past the weird alkali buttes of Ekalaka, Montana, and she was at the Battle of Killdeer Mountain and wrote about it. She later was freed, here's from her book, there's an idealized illustration of her attempt to slip a note to a favorable, a sympathetic Indian to try to get her ransomed. And then Sitting Bull was part of that battle, the Battle of Killdeer Mountain. So anyway, let me just read this little one piece and then we can take some questions about this. But you see, the point is that the Confederacy's withdrawal from the Union followed by the Civil War led to a perception that the white government was in disarray, or that this was the one opportunity when Indians could strike back. Meanwhile, they were being pushed by ineptitude and corruption into starvation and desperation. So in August of 1862, they rise up in Minnesota and commit this spasmodic act of violence against settlement. This leads to the largest mass hanging in American history, followed by, for 2 years, campaigns against recalcitrants in what's now North Dakota. But here's the amazing thing about this, Larry. Historians reckon that almost nobody who was attacked by Sully and Sibley had been in any way a part of the Minnesota uprising. That this was, every Indian's the same Indian as far as the white government is concerned. And so it was a punitive set of expeditions, but it was not surgical. It was meant to get at Dakota, Lakota, or Nakota and break their spirit of resistance so that this further settlement that we've been talking about all day could take place. And here's just this wonderful book, it's on your list, by Hank Cox, Lincoln and the Sioux Uprising of 1862. Here's what he concludes. Perhaps even more significant, the Sioux Uprising of 1862 sounded the first shots of a great Sioux war that would continue for 28 years, culminating in the massacre of Indian women and children at Wounded Knee in 1890. The Minnesota Sioux were the easternmost branch of the Sioux Nation, which up till then had had minimal exposure to white people. The Sioux warriors who fled west carried with them stories of the white men's perfidy, helping poisonous relations sow distrust and foment more violence. And he goes on to say that what happened at the Battle of the Little Bighorn and so on can be seen as a kind of a domino effect of the press of white settlement touching off this war, it coming out onto the Great Plains, creating an enmity between the Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, and white people, which then culminates in the great wars that we read about all of our lives.
Right. And the ripple effect of the Dakota War of 1862, just to give one example to add to what you're talking about there, in Colorado, you may have heard of the Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado, which occurs in December of, in fact, I think it was Christmas
64.
Day of 1864. And that, if you read the accounts of the newspapers prior to that occurrence, they make reference to what happened in Minnesota. And Coloradans are so afraid that what happened up in Minnesota in 1862 is about to happen to them in Colorado. And so they do this preemptive attack, if you will, against some peaceably settled Indians along Sand Creek.
But one of the points that's made by these historians is that because the United States government was so preoccupied in Tennessee and Virginia and so on, there was a lack of military infrastructure and discipline in the West, and it enabled Chivington and other freelancers to form militias to do this very work, that if the Army had done it, it would have been done with somewhat more restraint and discipline than people like Sibley did it at Sand Creek and elsewhere.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Fanny Kelly. I was just going to tell you a little side note on Indian history is that you could file claims if the Indians destroyed any of your property or stole your property or captured you. And Fanny Kelly filed a claim for $15,200. Now you got to think about that. That's a lot of money.
Well, she had a rough time.
She had a rough time. That's still a lot of money. And she ended up receiving $6,500.
What are you quoting from there, Larry?
It's a book on Indian depredation.
You wrote it, didn't you?
I did.
That's Larry's book. What's it called? I mean, people will be running to Barnes & Noble.
I'm sure they will. Indian depredation claims.
Indian depredation claims, yeah. We've heard of it.
We've heard of it.
Yeah.
You've heard it here.
But you know this Fanny Kelly story. It's a fascinating story. There was a white woman captive who was at the Battle of Killdeer Mountain and wrote kind of interestingly about it. And if you haven't read this, this is really an interesting account.
There are many really interesting captive stories. There were many Indian, particularly women, that were kidnapped by Indians, or young white children that were kidnapped by Indians, and ended up spending years with them before they were, as we would call, repatriated. And they did write accounts, and they're really fascinating stories.
Well, you know, we're about out of time. Maybe we can do a question or two here, if anyone has them about any.
Okay. So we've talked about the Homestead Act, the Railroad Act, the Morrill Act, and the Dakota War of 1862, and Lincoln's footprint, and we certainly would take any questions. Now, Robin does have a microphone. It does not actually amplify your voice, but it's needed for the camera so that the recording picks up your question.
Maybe people have had enough, too.
So,
you know,
yeah, maybe you've had enough. I don't know.
But if they have questions, this would be the right
Does anybody
time.
have any questions?
See, we did it.
We did it, huh?
exhausted our time.
Any questions at all? Yes,
There's
ma'am.
one.
Here we go.
Oh,
Back
okay.
to the photo of
Coming.
the two graves when you were talking about Fanny Kelly.
Coming. I took this photo last summer at Killdeer Mountain. That's Medicine Hole. That's there.
Those markers,
Yes.
were they placed there by the Daughters of the American Revolution?
I don't know the answer to that. They weren't placed there by the Historical Society of North Dakota. So somebody else did it, and it may well have been the DAR.
Is there a story there?
No, but they kind of look like the emblem, and that's what
Oh,
why I'm
okay.
questioning it.
It's a really interesting place to visit. I mean, it's, if you go to Killdeer and you go north of Killdeer by a couple of miles, it'll say Battle of Killdeer Mountain, and you go off on gravel roads, and you get to the base of North Killdeer Mountain, which is one of the most beautiful places in North Dakota anyway. And then there's this little 2-acre site that the DeVernacks have enabled the State Historical Society to have. This is the Diamond Sea Ranch, which has a Theodore Roosevelt connection too. But this is the monument at dusk as a flagpole. These graves are right here. And then here's the state sign from that era, kind of a WPA era sign about the battle. The DeVernacks are an extraordinary family. Alec DeVernack has recently been inducted into the North Dakota Cowboy Hall of Fame, and he spent his lifetime searching for artifacts on the mountains, cataloging them to the best of his capacity, enabling Dickinson State University now to have some of those artifacts. His son Craig still lives on the ranch. There are mountain lions up there. There are wolves up there. This is one of North Dakota's magic places, and it's just worth going out there just to see this historic monument. And it has a map, and you can sort of get a sense of what it must have been like to be both the Indians who are there in July of 1864, but also how weird it must have been to be Sully and his troops crossing this undifferentiated plain with no infrastructure of any sort, heading up to this site. I mean, they were, middle of nowhere doesn't cover how middle of nowhere this was. And Sully had created Fort Rice as a staging place. He had heard that there were Indians escaping towards Montana, towards the Yellowstone. So he rushed these 2,000 men out. There's a place on the Heart River just near Richardson, which is where he created his corral. It's also a state historic site. And then he took these 2,000 troops to the base of this mountain. This was as far off the map of the known world as you could possibly be in 1864. And the white government won a stunning victory. I think that we burned almost 100,000 pounds of Indian food, lodges, saddles, weapons, and so on. So not that many Indians were killed, about 100. 2 white people were killed in this famous battle. But the white government destroyed the Indians' capacity to carry on by wiping out its material economy for several years.
Okay, any other questions?
There's a question here.
Got a question down here? Get the mic here for you.
Trying to get back to Lincoln here.
Hi, thank you. You're right, it doesn't amplify.
It doesn't amplify.
Good. This has been really fascinating for me, thank you. I'm just here visiting from West Virginia. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind answering another question on the Civil War, going all the way back to those early slides. You guys talked about the sort of the numbers game that was being played between the number of senators' seats, and you mentioned the Northwest Territory, and I guess I got a little confused because if the original plan had been prior to secession, you'd said that Lincoln would have been acceptable to allowing slavery in the original 13 colonies. Wouldn't those numbers have still supported the South having an advantage?
Oh, you raise a great question. And it's a question
As
about,
opposed to the Northwest Territory line option.
yeah. Well, you know, the one way of looking at this is that the South made the worst possible decision to secede, because Lincoln really meant it when he said he was going to let the South maintain slavery. All that he was going to prevent was the extension of slavery into the Western territories. And if the South had just cut that deal,
Yeah.
they could have kept on as a slaveocracy for decades, maybe. But Lincoln's position was that he was not going to interfere with the constitutionally legal institution of slavery where it already existed. It wasn't just in the original 13 states, it was through the entire Confederacy, and all he insisted upon was no further. And historians puzzle over why the South didn't get it, that he was not fundamentally attacking their capacity to maintain their way of life within the district already slave.
2 points on this. The original 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution actually was going to protect slavery. The original one didn't pass. And also the Republican platform of 1860 said that the federal government would not interfere, again, to use the term domestic institutions, would not interfere in domestic institutions. So you're absolutely right. The slave states, if the Republicans were to be believed, and that was the other part to it. If you were a slaveholder in the South, keeping in mind that in the North they rang bells when John Brown was hung. Here's a man that tried to start a slave insurrection. And the South, for decades, had a couple, Nat Turner, for example, they had had some slave insurrections, and they were fearful. And I forget exactly, maybe Perry or Clay can remember, it's something like 13 million people live in the South, and of that, 6 million or 4 million are slaves. So it's like a 2 to 1. And so 4 million slaves revolted in the South. They were terrified to death of the possibilities. And so the Republican Party, it didn't help then when John Brown is trying to foment a slave insurrection in the South. And on the day he's hung, Northern church bells are rung in his honor. And so one of the platforms in the Republican Party was to denounce insurrection of any kind, and that was a direct reference to John Brown. So the Republicans wanted to distance themselves from John Brown. They wanted to give the Southerners assurance that domestic institutions they would not touch. The problem is that in our system, and Clay's right, you know, if they had stayed, we could suppose that their domestic institution could have lasted at least for a while.
A lot of the history that I've read indicates as well that, I mean, slavery wasn't economically feasible. It was, I think you'd said later on in your discussion that it probably couldn't have continued economically.
I think eventually slavery was going to die out. But when? I think Brazil is the last country in the Western Hemisphere to outlaw slavery, and it happens like in 1888 or something like that. That's a long time to have slavery around, and there were folks in the North that and there were abolitionists, they were immediate abolitionists, that all the slaves need to be freed now, and I guarantee you, they voted Republican in the 1860s.
The South didn't believe Lincoln's protestations that this would be the only way we prevented slavery from growing, but also, I mean, it bears resemblance a little bit to South Africa in the 1970s. I mean, the Afrikaners and the English South Africans knew that the handwriting was on the wall, that at some point in time they weren't going to be able to maintain apartheid. But they couldn't think of anything to do except to maintain it as long as they could. And that's sort of how the South was behaving too, that they knew that there was never going to be slavery in Dakota Territory. I mean, that's a ludicrous proposition. It really didn't even have a chance in Kansas. But they knew that they had to, if they wanted to maintain, if they had any chance of maintaining their life, even for a reasonable amount of time, they had to be paranoid about any real or perceived threat. And that's what touched off the secession movement.
Thank
Any
you.
last thoughts?
You're from West Virginia?
I'm originally from Minnesota, so
Oh.
you touched on all of my states here, but I live in West Virginia.
West Virginia.
And
West
right
Virginia
on the border. of-
didn't exist prior to the Civil War. Eight
Right.
counties of
Right.
Virginia seceded.
Right.
When Virginia seceded from the Union, 8 counties in western Virginia seceded and became West Virginia.
Well, you mentioned the railroad. I mean, they were the reason West Virginia became demarcated with the North, because the Baltimore, Ohio
Oh, sure.
Railroad, the North needed to make sure that the coal ran to Philadelphia.
Yeah,
So
great.
where I live, you had brothers fighting brothers, cousins.
So
We're
you
right
have a
on the border.
bibliography if you're interested about books that you can read on this subject. There's a huge and rich literature on this subject. Is there any last
Any
thought or
last
question?
thoughts or questions?
There's
Here's
last
a
one right
question
over
way
here.
over here.
What part did Sitting Bull play at the Battle of Killdeer Mountain? Not very large. Sitting Bull was a young man at the time. He was still sort of apprenticing. The Native American who played the big role there was a man named Caputa, and he had been involved in the Minnesota uprising to a certain degree, but he wasn't central to either one. I mean, these were really separate engagements that had little to do with each other except in the perception of the white government. But Sitting Bull was there, and Fanny Kelly writes about Sitting Bull in her captivity account, but he was not a major player at the Battle of Killdeer Mountain. His time was about 12 years in the future. But one last thing about this, we didn't talk about this, but the Fort Dilts, I don't know if you know Fort Dilts, it's down in your part of North Dakota, it's near Rame, it's between Rame and Marmarth. It's part of this same story. The people going to the gold fields of Montana in 1864, a white train of prospectors and entrepreneurs get hung up by Lakota near Marmarth and Rame because of the stirrings up that had occurred that year, and they were lucky to survive. They put up a breastwork of sod. You can still see it there. It's a marvelous, it's one of the greatest of all North Dakota historic sites. It's called Fort Dilts, and it's directly related, well, indirectly related to the mop-up operations in 63 and 64.
Oh, one other thing we didn't tell you, Little Crow was not hanged with the other 38 that actually ended up being hung that day. Little Crow, a couple months later, was actually near Hutchinson, Minnesota, and he was hungry and he stopped at this farmer's yard to pick berries, and the farmer saw him and shot and killed him. That's how
So
Little
if
Crow
you're
died.
interested, you can go to Whitestone, which is south of Jamestown. It's an extraordinary monument in North Dakota with monuments both to the white fallen and to the Native American fallen. It's one of the great historic battle sites in North Dakota. I think it was the largest Indian battle in North Dakota history. Most death occurred there. Killdeer Mountain has signage, and it's worth going to. The battles at Dead Buffalo Lake and Stony Lake and Big Mound all have signage there. If you go to Mankato, there are monuments there, and also at New Ulm. I mean, it's possible if you want to go on a cultural tour of these sites, and it's a very remarkable thing to do because you get, when you're out on that landscape and you see how stark it still is near Richardson and Killdeer, you get a sense of what was at stake and how far away this was from the centers of power.
Maybe we should do that next July 4th.
Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for coming.